When John Hennessy became president of Stanford University 16 years ago, Stanford was a top regional school in the middle ranks of very good schools of national standing. And now, as he prepares to step down as president of Stanford University, the institution has become undoubtedly one of the half dozen most important educational institutions on the face of the planet. Today we get to ask John Hennessy how he did it. Uncommon Knowledge now. Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. One of 6 children, John Hennessy grew up in Huntington, New York, received his BA in electrical engineering from Villanova, earned his MA and PhD in computer science from Stony Brook, married his high school sweetheart, and then traveled west to Stanford University, where he became an assistant professor of electrical engineering. That was in 1977. In 1986, Dr. Hennessy was named a full professor. In 1996, he was named Dean of the School of Engineering. In 1999, he was named Provost, Stanford's Chief Academic and Financial Officer. And in 2000, he was named the 10th President of Stanford University, a position from which he will step down on August 31st. During President Hennessy's 16 years in office, Stanford has seen its endowment grow from $6.2 billion to $21.5 billion, second only to the endowments of Harvard and Yale, for now, and has seen applications for undergraduate admissions climb from 18,000 to 44,000, becoming the most selective university in the country. President John Hennessy, welcome.
Thank you, Peter. Delighted to be here.
First things first, we'll get to your tenure as president in a moment, but you became a professor in 1977 and you became a dean in 1996. And for academics who go into administration, that's a break point, that's a transition. What were you thinking?
You're right, it is a transition. After working on my research for a number of years and also having started a company in the Valley, I had a wide range of experiences. I actually asked to be excused the first time I was asked to be a department chair because I felt like my research wasn't ready, my academic career wasn't ready. By the time I was asked to be eventually chair of computer science and then dean shortly 2 years later, I felt like I was ready to engage in trying to solve some of the bigger problems, ones that were outside the realm of any one department, and to think about how engineering, for example, in that case, as a discipline, should evolve and move forward.
Okay. Now, again, I'll get to the tenure in a moment, but you served first as provost, chief academic and budget officer. So can you distinguish the job of provost, for the layman, distinguish the job of provost from the job of president?
Yes. I think provost, think of chief operating officer. Think of the internal person running the day-to-day operation, making faculty appointments, deciding budget issues, things of that, dealing with student issues. Think of the president as both the strategic partner of the provost, because we work very closely together, but also as the outside person for the university. So the primary representative to alumni, to various government officials with respect to issues that involve the federal government, for example, and even local officials. That's probably a good way, but it's teamwork. I mean, the provost and I had met 3 times every week.
Oh,
together.
You did?
Right.
You did.
So
John Etchemendy,
John
Professor
Etchemendy,
yes.
who was my provost for 16 years,
Yes.
a great blessing for the university. We met with a high degree of frequency so that we could delegate tasks. We could hand responsibility back and forth between us, but in a way that didn't require us to duplicate one another's work.
So you're touching base, here's the strategic vision, that's John Hennessy, here's day-to-day operation, and you're tuning up each other, adjusting each according to the other constantly.
Yes, together with our deans. I mean, one of the things I think that has benefited Stanford in terms of its ability to move forward has been that the chief planning group of the university is what we call the executive cabinet.
Yes.
It's the deans, the vice provost for undergraduate education, graduate education, dean of research, the president and the provost. But it's an academic planning group that covers the entire university, from the medical school to the law school and the business school. And that group works at frequently enough and meets frequently enough that it forms a cohesive thoughtful, ambitious planning group for the academic side of the
So
institution.
now let's take, at some point in 1999, you were asked if you'd consider being part of the search for the new president. It is very difficult. Now, this is a kind of business. Think of this as a systems problem, engineering problem. I just want to see how your mind works on this question. It is very hard to imagine any institution or enterprise in which so many of the variables are fixed. Stanford is where it is. You can't shut this down and outsource to Mexico. Your faculty is extremely difficult to deal with in the straightforward sense that departments do the hiring. Once they're tenured, they're very difficult to get rid of. Laws are such that you can't even do much to suggest it's time for older faculty to retire. Location fixed, faculty fixed. You don't choose the board of trustees. You've got Stanford's board is 36, as I recall.
Right.
What were you look at this system and say to yourself, I would say to myself, how do I keep it from eating me alive? This thing is just going to, this thing rolls along. What are the levers here?
It does. I mean, people are surprised that, for example, from year to year, you have control. You can change less than 1% of the budget from year to year. Because the rest of it is all fixed.
All the action is on the margins.
Right. So all the action is on the margins. All the action is on forming a new vision, working with the faculty, because you're absolutely right. The faculty can do extraordinary things, provided that the resources are aligned with what they see as the right vision.
Right.
So academic planning inherently has to be a bottoms-up initiated approach with, of course, some top-down, what I think of myself as an organizer, a matchmaker that finds, well, there's interest in the medical school in working more closely with engineering. There's interest in engineering in developing more focus on biomedical applications. Let's see if we can't bring the two together so that the whole becomes greater than the sum of the parts.
What I just find so surprising about this, obviously it works. We're talking about you at the end of your 16 years when it all worked. But your background is in the hard stuff. Your background is in the quantitative stuff. And what you're describing here are skills that at the business school they'd call organizational behavior.
People skills. They're all people skills.
This is the softer stuff, so to speak.
In the end, the financial part is hard. Even when we had to go through the financial crisis and we had to cut $500 million out of the university budget, roughly. Even when we had to go through that, the key was not whether or not you had to do it. The numbers were quite clear. You had to cut.
Right.
Or you either had to cut quickly or spend the next 5 to 10 years cutting slowly, right? Certainly less morale building and more destructive to the institution. The key was, how do you convince people of the urgency of dealing with this, because it's a difficult problem.
Right.
It's a people issue, and that's what you've got to do. I mean, I learned, the time I spent in the Valley was like an accelerated learning process, because you start a company hits the wall. You've got to make cuts, you've got to make changes, or you're going to be out of business in a year, 6 months, right? The university doesn't go out of business that quickly.
Right.
But the trajectory can change.
Yes, it can.
The trajectory can change. And then it's very hard to get back on the right trajectory.
Right. Let me take, if I may, a couple of successes that are not academic, that are kind of, so to speak, the offbeat successes that wouldn't be the first paragraph in the write-ups on what you did here. Money. The Stanford endowment grows from $6.2 billion to $21.5 billion. Again, that's just behind Harvard and Yale. And as best I can make it out, looking at the figures, in 9 of the last 10 years, Stanford raised more money than any other college or university in the nation. So Harvard and Yale should feel your breath on the backs of their necks. And the question is, how do you do that, John? I mean, Stanford is already at $6.2 billion. It wasn't up there with Harvard and Yale, but it was still in the first rank of endowed schools. How do you get rich people and rich foundations to give money to an institution that's already pretty rich? How do you do this?
Well, you start with people who are philanthropically inclined, who want to make a difference in the world and use their treasure to do well for other people. Then you need a big vision. That vision can be around, for example, for us, a big part of it was financial aid. We want to make it easier for both middle income and lower income families to come to Stanford. We want a simple model for financial aid so that that young person in a rural area or an inner city who is really capable and sees our sticker price doesn't just go into shock and say, I can't possibly go to Stanford. There's no way they'll give me $40,000 in financial aid a year. Well, there is a way that they'll give you $40,000. In fact, they'll give you $65,000 in financial aid. So that was key.
70% of undergraduates receive some portion, some degree of financial aid.
Yeah, a little less than that. A little less than that. That probably includes loans.
Okay.
But about 50% get money directly from the university.
Got it. All right.
Right. And right now, that amount is roughly $30,000 per student on financial aid. So they're getting a significant amount.
Right.
They're paying for roughly half their
People
cost
who
of their
simply
education.
could not come here are coming.
Right, exactly.
All right.
So that's a compelling mission, though. You go out and talk to alumni about the importance of doing that, particularly with this issue that we have growing issues and concerns over inequality in our country and access. That's a compelling mission. You go out and say, well, we're going to put together the best engineering school with one of the best medical schools in the country, and we're going to find new solutions to really challenging, hard problems in cancer or in neurodegenerative disease. That's a compelling story for people. So it really is about making a difference. It's about doing something. It's about taking the university to the next level, seeing the university as a bigger force for solving the most critical issues we have in the world.
Okay. I'd like to do another couple of these. Bricks and mortar. As I counted, about 70 construction there are all kinds of little construction projects.
That includes some renovations, but
there have been moments, actually even now, you go up to the Hoover Tower and you can still see plenty of cranes. I mean, it looked like Beijing for a while there, with construction absolutely everywhere. Brand new science and engineering quad. It's big, and it was how much money in the ground does that represent?
That's about $750 million, probably.
Got it. Brand new campus for the Graduate School of Business at about $400 million, as I recall. A new arts district, which includes a spectacular new modern art museum, the Anderson Collection, a spectacular new concert hall, on and on and on. Now, it is, I think it's fair to say, fairly standard, a problem, something you'll see as you look at universities, that a president discovers he can't actually do much with the faculty, he can't do much here, so he's just going to build himself a monument and go to bricks and mortars. That's not the way you operate. At the same time, though, you didn't need to do what you did just to solve the university's space requirements. There's some sense I get that bricks and mortar somehow ties into the central mission. It's important to a sense of morale, to a sense of excitement. Explain your thinking there. How does that work? How do you think about that?
There are two drivers for bricks and mortar in a university. One is the need to keep the infrastructure and the quality of the infrastructure, particularly on science and engineering, where the fields are advancing.
Capital investment has to happen constantly.
We were still in buildings that were built in the 50s in some cases, right? That were built when Stanford experienced its first big growth wave in the post-World War II era and started to build out science and engineering under Sterling and Terman. They were horrendous shape. We needed to replace those. We also needed to send a message about the quality of architecture and the look and feel of campus, that you didn't walk over to the engineering side of campus, right, one of our best schools, and see something that looked like a post-World War II slum. Right. So that was important. We couldn't do the work we needed to do. Right. We did something different, though, when we did that. We said, we're not going to build buildings for departments. We're going to build buildings around interdisciplinary themes. So we built a building for people working in the environment and energy, and it's got people from 8 different departments in it. We built a building for people working at the nanoscale and worried about nanoengineering and nanoscience, and it's got people from 3 different departments in it. This notion of trying to mix these together as a way to get collaborative research to fire up by using physical space as a way to do that. That goes back to the Clark Center, which was our original vision.
Your friend Jim Clark?
That Jim Clark had. And, the Clark Center, the 40 faculty moved in on day one, represented 18 different departments. That kind of collaborative, cross-disciplinary work.
For people who don't know the campus, the most striking aspect of the Clark Center is that you can see through it. It's made very substantially of glass. So transparency is literally taking place there. People can see, they see each other.
Professors' offices are inside glass boxes within the laboratories.
Right.
It's a way to really get that collaboration model going.
Right. One more of these sort of offbeat subjects, athletics. Now, my education took place back east. The Ivy League formed itself into a league, formally an athletic league.
It's an athletic league.
In the 1950s, on the explicit understanding that academic distinction and distinction in athletics were in tension with each other. And you had to choose whether you were going to be good at sports or good at academics. And the Ivies said, we're going to be good at academics, therefore we're going to hem in what the coaches can do, the kind of recruiting and so forth. Fine. Stanford University says, I think we can be pretty good at academics and sports. And so you've got an athletic program here that for 21 years in a row has won the Director's Cup for the most successful overall Division I athletic program in the country. With the Olympics coming up in Rio soon, I checked back on the London Olympics of 4 years ago. Stanford sent 42 athletes to the Olympics and brought home 12 gold medals. And these are all pretty smart kids. Or they wouldn't get into Stanford.
Right.
How the heck does Stanford pull that off?
Well, it is a fairly unique. There are only a few. There's essentially no other institution that tries to do it across the board the way we try to do it. They do it in individual sports. We do it by maintaining the mission, the notion of the student athlete, and I say student athlete, not athlete student, student athlete.
Student athlete.
There are no
first.
majors. There are no separate majors. They are in the same majors that all the rest of our students are
No
on.
place for the athletes to hide.
Exactly. They don't live in an athletic house. They live with the other students, and they become part of the academic community. And so we try to find ways to support them, but it begins by finding students who not only have the academic skill, but also can be successful athletically. Obviously, I mean, with so many teams and winning so many NCAA championships, you need that, and then you hold that academic standard very high, and that's key. And it's key that the coaches understand it and they know how to do recruiting. Our biggest challenge in recruiting isn't finding good athletes; it's finding good athletes who are also great students.
Right.
And we have to do that.
Right. What makes Stanford Stanford? Let me quote, John, if I may, a cover letter that you sent to the city of New York when New York was accepting bids for institutions to build campuses on Roosevelt Island and the East River. Just a very brief quotation. Stanford NYC, which is what the project was called, Stanford NYC has the potential to help catapult New York City into a leadership position in technology, close quote. Now, here's what I find striking about that one sentence. New York City is almost 3 centuries old. It already boasts some spectacular educational institutions. You've got Columbia, you've got NYU, and since before the founding of the Republic, it's been the financial center for the nation. Why was technology leadership here instead of there in the first place? What I'm trying to get at is this whole question of what happened in this valley and why did it happen here?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. There are obviously lots of pieces that came together in the right place. And I think it goes back to the early heritage in California. It was a pioneering community. It was people who trekked across the United States.
And you came here in 77. Did you still feel that?
Oh, absolutely.
Back east?
I mean, 77, it was still, the valley was still in its nascent state. I mean, Intel was a moderate-sized company, not a gigantic company.
It was still silicon.
They
were still fabricating wafers
Still
here.
silicon, still fabricating wafers. The computer industry was still back east. I mean, as a computer scientist, I wanted to talk to leaders in the computer industry. I got on a plane and I flew to New York to go to IBM, or I flew to Boston to go to DEC and the mini computer companies. It was still centered back there. But there was a vibrancy here. The integrated circuit technology clearly was the future. There was an entrepreneurial risk-taking acceptance. And I think equally importantly, there was a symbiotic view of the relationship between industry and the academy. They weren't seen as enemies of one another. They were seen as people working on technology that had different points in the spectrum. Industry much closer to product development, university much closer to thinking about the future and thinking about future research. But they were not seen as enemies of one another. That made it much easier to get collaborative working relationships and to develop what became Silicon Valley over time.
Back to Stanford NYC, just briefly. I know that's a saga in itself, but frankly, it's not that interesting a saga as a saga. But briefly speaking, New York City attempted to change some of the terms. There was a question of reopening negotiations, and John Hennessy said, no, we're out. When you look back on it, are you just as happy in the end that campus on Roosevelt Island went to Cornell instead of to Stanford? In other words, have you thought through, did that lead you to think through the importance of this place in a new way? Did it sharpen your thinking on the importance of geography?
Yeah, it certainly caused us to double down on what we were doing here. Had we done that, that would have taken so much administrative leadership time that there were other things we simply couldn't have done, Peter. And I think in retrospect, it was a bold experiment. We were doing something in a way that no other institution has ever done, which is to say there's one institution with two geographically separated locations. There's not an A campus and a B campus. And I think that's very hard to do, but was the right way to think about such a structure. The fact that it didn't happen gave us the opportunity to really focus on doing things on the core campus, which I think have paid off in enormous ways.
So if I may, I'd just like to ask one more question to try a kind of thought experiment to get at the interplay between the university and its immediate surroundings right here in Northern California. And the thought experiment runs as follows. Pick up all 8,000 acres and put them down in Texas. And here's why I say Texas, because you'd gain things that are pretty obvious. Your faculty would be able to afford housing. Your tax and regulatory overlay would drop sharply. There are gains there. What would be lost? What would be lost?
So one of the great things about this area is people really love living here. They really love it. And it's the weather, it's the feel. This region is a region that can welcome people from anywhere in the world. Right. They can find other people who come from that part of the world. They can find whatever kind of food they like to eat, whatever kind of community they like to go with. In that sense, it's become the #1 talent magnet in the world. It draws more talent related to this than any other area.
You've been able to stay on top of housing prices? You haven't found it harder and harder to attract faculty?
Because housing faculty prices... We're working on, obviously faculty has been a challenge, and we import faculty from around the world. So the budget, the amount we're spending on that now is probably getting close to $100 million a year that we're having to put into helping to subsidize and loans and creating faculty housing.
I think just to even up the playing field.
Just to even up the playing field.
One item. Okay.
Because it's more efficient to do it by doing a housing thing than it is to do by just adding to salary.
I see.
So I think long term we do have to worry about staff and what we're going to do about the staff that work for the university, and the Valley has to worry about that as well. Right. How is it going to continue to house people? It's becoming more urbanized, but it's doing it in fits and starts as it tries to hold on to this former suburban notion in an area that rapidly is becoming a semi-urban, very semi-urban area.
Now you mentioned one other theme I'd like to just push for a moment or two here. I'm going to quote from Ken Auletta's piece. He wrote a long piece on the university, 2012, I think, in the New Yorker. And there's some stuff that's really, it still resonates as you prepare to step down. I'm quoting Ken Auletta in the New Yorker. If the Ivy League was the breeding ground for the elites of the American century, you go to the Ivy League and you get a feeling that you're expected to help run the country. That's what you're there for. Stanford is the farm system for Silicon Valley. Stanford's Office of Technology Licensing has licensed 8,000 campus-inspired inventions. Faculty members commonly invest in startups. At Stanford, more than elsewhere, the university and business forge a borderless community. That's just what you were talking about earlier. You yourself, while president, have sat on the boards of, I think you're still on the boards of Cisco
and Google.
Google, okay. So that's fair, right? And probably I ought to give you a moment or two to explain why there's no conflict of interest, because somebody, go ahead and do that, gets raised, and
Well,
and
I think
dismissed.
conflict of interest is certainly an issue. The way you address it is through both disclosure and in the cases that recusal is appropriate. So I'm recused from anything. There are not that many things that occur between, let's say, Google or Cisco and Stanford, but there are a few, and I'm recused from all those. And that manages the situation.
This can be handled. In other
It
words.
can be handled.
Okay.
It begins with transparency. I think I'm a full believer in transparency. Everybody needs to understand that.
Okay, so we've got this point that you made. Auletta picked up on it when he visited the campus, that the university does not look down on trade, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
The commercial development of ideas that are generated here. So here's the question: to what extent can that be replicated elsewhere? To what extent is Stanford creating a model that can be put to use elsewhere, and to what extent is this just a miraculous one-off?
It's an interesting question, Peter. I think this notion that the university can combine both the study of more idealistic, long-term, fundamental human questions, the humanities and the social sciences, together with the more pragmatic disciplines, that it can be doing both astronomy, trying to understand how the universe evolved, and can also be inventing the next generation computer technology. That actually, the Stanfords had that in their mind from day one. It was part of what formed the university. Universities are created, and that history tends to be part of, it gets baked into the institution. It's certainly, if you go to Yale, you get the feel.
Right. Founding moments matter.
Founding moments matter.
And the Stanfords, Leland Stanford was developing California, railroad man and so forth, and in their founding document, they wanted the education to be practical, as opposed to the Ivies, which I believe every single one of them was originally founded as a religious institutions, eyes on the next world, on matters of philosophy.
And men only.
And men only. Exactly. This was coeducational from the get-go.
Right.
And so you can't work backwards.
It's hard.
It's hard to do.
It's hard to do. I think institutions can evolve, but academic institutions evolve very slowly.
Got it. Okay, John, if you don't mind, a couple of critiques.
Sure.
There's not going to be anything here you haven't heard. Somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 colleges and universities in the country. Only about 70, as I was able to count it, have endowments of $1 billion or more. Mm-hmm. And endowments like Stanford's that are in the double digits, you've got a tiny number. It's fewer than a dozen.
Right.
Here's a quotation from Malcolm Gladwell, the writer, quote, "If Stanford cut its endowment in half and gave it to other worthy institutions, then the world would be a better place. You would also be in trouble with your board,
yeah,
but the world would be a better place." So this whole notion, and the dispersion is increasing, this whole notion that higher education is in some way becoming a winner-take-all game, that the top institutions are favored in a way that the other institutions can't hope to match, and that it's increasing. What do you do with that?
Well, I think there's certainly a challenge that we face in higher education, particularly along the divide between the publics and the privates. But not just that. It's broader than that. It also affects the privates that are less well endowed. But the publics are suffering from now probably 2 decades of underinvestment, of budget cutting, driven by real financial issues that the states have, including the rise in healthcare costs that they've had to be burdened with. But that is leading to an erosion of the ability of the publics to compete. I think the truth is that if we cut our endowment in half, there are a lot of things we would stop doing tomorrow, including our financial aid program, including being able to hire faculty in a variety of areas. I think what's key, and this is certainly an issue that we have to face every single day, the next potential donor we talk to, who we're asking to give money to the university, we have to be able to justify how we're going to ensure that their investment gets the kind of social return that they're looking for. And philanthropists are looking for a social return. They're not, but that's the way philanthropists that come to Stanford and in this valley think. They think about themselves as investors. Right. They're investing in the university to get a social philanthropic return. And we have to convince them that we're going to be good stewards of their money and that they're going to get a good social return on that money. And if we can't do that, we will not be able to raise money.
And to what extent does the university face the venture fund problem, which is as your fund gets bigger, it's harder and harder to show a return on investment?
Sure.
Does it get harder at the margins as the university
It gets
grows?
harder if you don't do anything new.
Okay.
If your argument is, give me more money to do what I'm doing today,
Got it.
that's not a, I don't find it compelling if somebody comes to me and says that, and I don't think a donor would find it compelling.
All right.
But take the new scholarship program we're starting, right?
The Knight Hennessy program.
Knight Hennessy program. Here's an opportunity to take 100 truly extraordinary people from around the world every year, bring them here, give them all their education, graduate with zero debt, to build some leadership development program, and to really make an important contribution. Bringing people to an institution whose culture and approach is fairly unique and fairly different, as it is on the West Coast. And I think that makes a compelling vision for people to see how 20 years from now, you look back at the list of people who've come through this program and you say, look what they're doing in the world.
Right. You can track that. You can track that. You can keep an eye on those people.
You can.
One other element of the critique here. Let me give you a statistic and then a quotation. So here's the statistic. Stanford University 50 years ago, here are the three most popular majors: history, political science, biology. The three most popular majors today: computer science, human biology.
Biology is still, actually, if you
there.
add together human biology and biology,
It's still there.
it's actually the largest major.
Oh, it is?
If you add biology and human biology together.
Okay. Well, then let's say biology, computer
they're still
science,
up
and
there.
engineering. So you've got this shift from,
Right.
broadly speaking, humanities over to the harder sciences, computer sciences, and so forth. Now, here's a quotation from your friend and from an eminent member of the faculty, David Kennedy, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian. Quote, "The entire Bay Area is enamored with these notions of innovation, entrepreneurship, mega success. It's an atmosphere that can be toxic to the mission of the university as a place of refuge, contemplation, and investigation for its own sake." Close quote. Stanford does a great job teaching kids how to make money. Does it do a good job of teaching them how to lead good lives?
I hope so. I mean,
So how
we
do you,
certainly,
you've heard this again and again
surely,
and again.
Surely,
how do you
surely.
answer? How do you answer
Well,
this?
I think, first of all, we start with the notion that we are a liberal arts institution. We are not a technical training institution. We're not a technical university. We're a liberal arts institution. And we start with the simple basis that every single person in the university has a set of liberal arts requirements, whether they're an engineering major, a history major, or a biology major. And that's the beginning of a broad education, because we do believe that that broad education is critical to the long-term future. I think around the country, not just at Stanford, humanities majors have dropped essentially everywhere. This generation of students is much more focused on career. And add together to the economic uncertainty that's arisen in the last decade or so, they're much more risk aversive. They're thinking a lot more about how am I going to... Even at Stanford. Well, they're not risk aversive in the sense that they know if they get a tech major and they go into a startup and the startup fails, there'll be another job opportunity out there.
Exactly. You're just
But
young
they're
man,
more-
young woman, you will be employable.
They will be.
Right.
And this is true for all our majors. You know, one of the stories I like to tell is when you look out 20 years at our majors, 20 years out, turns out our philosophy majors are among the most highly compensated after 20 years. And you think, philosophy majors? Well, of course, they're not professional philosophers for the most part, right? They went to medical school, they went to business school, they went to law school. They got additional education. And that's the thing that we have to keep front in the students' minds. I mean, I think it's an exciting time in technology. Technology is probably changing the world in a way that nothing else really has in recent times, nothing can touch. And that attracts young people. But I think we need to think broadly about how we're educating them and what we're preparing them for, and get them to think not just about the short-term things that are ephemeral, as so many things in technology are, but the long-term things. What are your values? What do you know about history? What do you know about being a good citizen? Those are critical issues for young people.
All right. Last few questions, John. This is you in 2012. Quote, "There's a tsunami coming. We know online education is going to be important and in the long run transformative to education. We don't really understand how yet, close quote. I'll take a moment to set this up and then just turn it over to you. This institution has been right at the middle of one disruption after another. So the Google algorithms are discovered here, and they go out and wipe out the old business model for journalism, for example, by advertising. All kinds of pieces of the so-called driverless technology were and are being developed here, and we know right now that's going to overturn the entire automotive industry in this country. To what extent, as you prepare to step down, do you say to yourself, Stanford itself could be next? There may be some disruptions coming our way. How do you grapple with that as a kind of theme?
So I think there are changes coming. I think, as I said in that quote, we don't exactly know how.
Right.
I think what's become clear is that the world of continuing education, whether related to people who want to get education just for their own good and for broadening their interests, or a much larger community, the professionals out there who want to continue to evolve and learn, enhance their skills, they're moving quickly to the online world. They're moving quickly there. The notion of coming back to a physical place, stopping your job, and it just doesn't work anymore. It just doesn't work. So we're seeing that change. I think undergraduate education is much harder to change, particularly at a place that has a residential model of undergraduate education. Right. The learning that goes on is 24/7, and it happens as much in the residences as it happens in the classroom.
And you're producing not just individuals, but a kind of community through time.
Yes, you are.
Right.
You are. And so that I think has been much more resistant to change. I think other parts of the model are beginning to change. For example, how do we think about remedial education for the vast majority of people who graduate from high school? Even the majority who go to college are not fully prepared to be in college. Right. How do we bring them up to speed? Well, that's a terrific use of online technology. Instead of having them spend their summer in their senior year between high school and college doing nothing, you can actually prepare them for their college time. So I think we're going to see increasingly different experiments. What we have discovered, I think, in this process is that how people learn is extremely complicated, highly varied, both in terms of the rate at which they can accept information and the way they like to get that information, whether it's through a video, through reading, through a live classroom. It's very varied. And I think that's meant that in order to launch a new technology, we need to do a lot more experiments with that technology, see what works. I think we do have one thing that really works. I think the flipped classroom notion, this notion that you don't attend a large lecture, you watch a video, and then engage in a smaller interactive discussion, problem-solving, discussion of the material. That is a model that we know works at least as well as a conventional classroom. In fact, the evidence is out there is that it works somewhat better if you include the amount of time the students need to spend to master the material.
Isn't that more expensive, John?
It's cheaper.
It's cheaper?
Because you create the initial lecture.
Right.
That costs significantly more to get decent production values.
Right.
But then you don't necessarily need the great master teacher to run the interactive session. You can do that perhaps with a lecturer or perhaps even an advanced PhD student. In that way, you can create not a gigantic cost savings, but maybe you can save 25% of the cost.
That's not nothing.
And I think given the pressure that exists in higher education, we're going to have to try experiments like that to see what really works.
Right. By the way, I'd be remiss, I have to ask, I know the answer because I've heard you address it, but let's get it on tape here. Why is it that the cost of education over your tenure, but even longer than that, have continued to climb faster than the inflation rate?
So the price has certainly climbed. For us, the actual cost after inflation has actually gone down. So the average amount that a student pays today after financial aid has gone up slower than inflation. But the list price has gone up faster, and of course, some of those students are paying the list price indeed, right? The key issue is that it's a labor-intensive business. It's driven by labor costs. every enhancement we make, for example, when we put in small seminars for all freshmen, that actually costs money. That actually adds to your costs. But it's a labor-intensive business. There's a great analogy that's often used to think about four musicians playing Vivaldi's Four Seasons for the very first time in the late 1700s, right? It took them 23 minutes to play it. It takes 23 minutes to play it today, but those four musicians make a lot more money today than they did then. And that's a dilemma. That's why you've got to find a way. What we have to do in higher education is bend the cost curve, but without reducing quality. I know how to bend the cost curve if I don't care about quality. Right. I just say all lectures are now 200 people.
Right.
Boom.
Right.
I get a cheaper education, but I get an inferior education. The key is, can we do that without reducing quality? And that, I believe technology is going to be the key. We just have to figure out how to make that key work in the lock.
All right. Final couple of questions, if I may, about you, John. Your life is, I go to football games. There's President Hennessy. I go to the gym. Every so often, I can force myself out of bed early. I've seen you at the gym at 6 in the morning.
Yeah.
And you already have a sweat going. So, there are budget meetings and faculty meetings, and you've just explained that you're the one who makes pitches to major donors and develop. When have you found the time to think? How have you run your life during these 16 years?
That is a very insightful question, Peter. Many years ago, in some of these books tell you about how to manage your life, and I read one of them that made a very interesting point about the fact that very busy people end up spending too much of their time on things that are time critical, but not fundamentally important to the long-term part of the institution, and too little of their time on the long-term strategic things. So I try to preserve time for that, and I try to use what we're doing in terms of planning exercises or getting together with the deans as a way to structure and think about those things. But you've got to preserve that time to really think. Otherwise, the crisis of the day will occupy your mind constantly.
Even though over the long term, the crisis of the day may not be that important.
It's not. It's probably not. Or you tend to spend more time fretting over it because it's on top of you at that moment.
Got it. Now, you're 63, and as I just mentioned, you can be seen at the gymnasium at 6 in the morning. So you have time left. What's next? You're going to be the director of the Knight Hennessy Scholarship Program.
Right.
And will that absorb all your time?
That'll absorb most of my time. I'm looking forward to getting back to teaching. I've taught maybe 4 or 5 times since I've been president, but I look forward to getting back in the classroom on a regular basis. I really love teaching.
Could I ask a nasty question?
Sure.
Are you still current in your discipline?
You know, it's interesting you asked
I know
that
that's
question.
a dirty question, but it's been 16 years.
Yeah,
John.
so what's kept me current is many years ago, actually in 1990, a colleague up at Berkeley, we published a graduate textbook, which was in my field, which has become the dominant textbook. And we've done 5 editions. We're just starting on the 6th edition. And this forces me to go read a lot of research papers, talk to a lot of people, and get really engaged with the discipline. So
you've been handling the revised editions?
Yes. So I've been doing this every few summers. I work on one, and I take 2 months during the summer. Probably it takes probably half my time during a summer, and I work on that as a way to keep up with what's going on.
John, for a little more than a month, you still have a university to run. So here's a final question, if I may. You're famous for visiting a few freshman dorms every fall to greet the new class, take their questions, and offer a few words of advice on how they ought to spend their 4 years at this place. Next fall, for the first time in 16 years, freshmen will arrive, and John Hennessy won't be there to greet them in their freshman dorms, at least not as president. As a kind of summary statement, John, what would you like to say to the kids arriving next fall? What advice would you give to the Stanford University class of 2020 about how they should use their 4 years here?
So what I always tell them, Peter, is that this time is going to go faster than they can possibly imagine. And they should really try to take advantage of it. Jump in, take a freshman seminar, Think about whether you want to go abroad and where you want to go. Think about developing relationships with faculty members, because those relationships are ones that not only help you develop as a person, but give you a lifelong connection to somebody at the university. I usually conclude by telling them that Stanford is a very special place. Generations of students are linked across many, many years, and that they'll become part of that larger community that is not just the current students on campus, but the hundreds of thousands of alumni around the world. And that's they're going to be part of the Stanford family for the rest of their lives. But this is a time when they'll really embed themselves, and they'll really take advantage of being here as their only job, as their only assignment. And they should take that on with vigor and energy, because it is a really unique opportunity they've been given.
John Hennessy, the 10th president of the Leland Stanford Union University, and by universal acclaim, one of the most consequential figures in the history of this place since Leland Stanford himself, thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
For Uncommon Knowledge and the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, I'm Peter Robinson.